So part of the reason I actually wanted to hold this in the this event in the Brecht is precisely to not only be able to field your questions, but also to discuss together different ways of going forward. We say that in this closed Guantanamo Justice statement that might be running out in the back, but again is on our website. One line that I just put in there that generally doesn't tend to get put into documents produced by human rights organizations fighting to close Gitmo, right? Which can be very much of a single issue thing, but just one little line that said something about, expressing our opposition against abuses at U.S. detention centers, wherever they may be, whether they're in Guantanamo, in Bagram, in immigration jails here. I see people in the room here who have advocated on behalf of Fahad Hashmi, who was tortured for close to 3 years in pretrial conditions of confinement right here at the MCC, is now in Florence prison suffering under solitary. I'm not trying to equate all of these things in a sloppy way to say it's all the same thing, but I do think that people working on all these different movements, there must be ways in which we can come together. And even putting that line in that statement, just the overwhelming response that we got, and people who, maybe even as people who work around Guantanamo, haven't worked together, offering their support, saying they'll come to DC, or if not now, how can we work together going forward? I know the goodwill is there, and certainly the talents and energies in this room and beyond. So with acknowledging that, I wanted to open it up to questions and discussion for a bit at least. And I'm going to take, I think, a few questions / comments at a time.
What's the, how do you present the case of Lynn Stewart and the prosecution and the resentencing of Lynn Stewart with regard to Guantanamo and Eric Holder and Obama? So I'm just putting out a basic request. Lynn Stewart has now been moved to Carswell Detention Center in Texas. She was also at MCC that you just mentioned. So I just want to hear what somebody think about it.
I'm going to field a couple of more. So there's a question about Lynn Stewart here. Please, sir.
I have a question for the legal experts. With some of the legislation that has been passing in Congress prohibiting the president from using funds to close Guantanamo and moving prisoners to the U.S., one of the things that has been possibly proposed is he do what President Bush did, sign some of these legislations with a signing statement that says this might go against his constitutional powers as president. Perhaps even Barack Obama was critical of President Bush when he did so many of these signing statements at times of signing bills into law. Would you encourage the president to do something like that so that he could empower himself to close Guantanamo, use funds, even though it's been legislated in Congress that he can't?
Okay, so I think maybe, so that's two questions we have. Should we just take these? One more, a couple more. Let's take a couple more. So we have, I haven't forgotten you, Lynn Stewart signing statements. Don't forget Wikileaks is part of the discussion as well.
Hi, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the Pardiss Kebriaei case. Why is he being cleared, or why was he forcibly transferred now, especially with the developments over the last 2 weeks? And is there an expectation, does anybody even know what will happen when he goes back? Is there any expectation that he will be immediately detained and then released? And is this sort of happening under the radar, or hopefully people won't be noticing that it's happening among all the other Guantanamo inmates?
Let's start with you. So that's sort of the most immediate thing I think on our mind, so maybe we'll start there.
I mean, my understanding of why the administration sent him back is because the State Department has reached a conclusion that conditions in Algeria are not such that he would have credible fears of torture or persecution if he were returned, and that the situation has changed from that of however many other years ago when they had determined that there might have been a risk. And that now the U.S. and the Algerian government seem to have reached a place where they are in agreement that men can be returned, and that's a State Department conclusion. The problem in the courts is that, this realm of executive determinations about foreign policy and these kinds of matters, the courts have been saying are exclusively in the realm of the executive branch, so that the judiciary has no role in reviewing those decisions. So again, what's disturbing isn't whatever one may think about the conditions in Algeria or Farhi's fears. There's been no review of what he's been saying. So I think that's the That's the concern. And as I was saying, I mean, there's both an objective and a subjective element to these fears. And his subjective fear, I think, was clear. He won his habeas case in November of 2009. There was a very strong order by Judge Kessler in the DC District Court that found his, over 9-year detention unlawful, and yet he was still fighting. He could have left a year ago, and I think he was actually cleared by military review boards years before that. So he could have left Guantanamo a long time ago, and the fact that he was fighting through every tool he had in the courts to try to stay, I think really speaks for itself. As for men who've been returned, what we know is that they go through an initial period of secret detention for about 2 weeks, where they are not, from my understanding, not offered access to an attorney or, essentially held incommunicado while they are questioned by Algerian security forces and intelligence officials, and then released. And some have been then investigated and charged. That's been our understanding of the initial period anyway. And I think the situation, there was another Algerian who went back a few months ago. There have been 2. This is the second forcible transfer of an Algerian under Obama. The first individual who was sent back, I think, is doing fine. He's with his family. But the fears are different based on the different individuals. And Farhi's fears were more about targeting he might experience from private insurgent groups, not the government necessarily. And those are groups against whom the government can't necessarily ensure protection. So it's sort of a different matter, and it was more about private fear from private actors. So that's the concern. And it's really, what we're demanding now is for the Algerian government to come forward and give information about his whereabouts and ensure that he is okay, which they did not do after the first transfer. And it was actually only after statements by CCR, and the New York Times wrote a very strong editorial basically calling the first transfer an act of inexplicable cruelty, where in response to, I think, public pressure, the Algerian government then did come out and affirm that the first individual was okay, and that he was not held in secret detention.
Pardiss mentioned the last transfer, Mr. Naji, who was terrified and didn't want to go back to Algeria, but was forced to. He was disappeared, and and later on the Algerian government tried to say it was routine and no big deal, and so did the U.S. But at first the Algerians said, well, we don't have him, and the Americans said, well, we don't have him, and he was not to be found. And it was really only after a real outcry by allies such as yourselves, by CCR, picked up by the New York Times in a good op-ed, that then the next day suddenly he appeared. So obviously the involuntary transfer, forcible transfer, in our eyes is wrong. Not only should it be considered legally wrong, but ethically. For a man who's been suffering the torture of indefinite detention for so long, to so desperately not want to go someplace that he'd actually choose to remain in Guantanamo. Don't be fooled by your government, as I'm sure you're not. Guantanamo is no place where you'd want to spend a night. So there's that sort of horror that's keeping people from wanting, certain men from wanting to go back to their countries of citizenship, and that fear should be respected. So I'm sure all of you will raise your voices next time you hear about a forcible transfer of an Algerian, or currently after tonight, because I think it does make a difference.
I just wanted to respond to James's question as well about the possible signing statements, lawmakers restricting the president's ability to bring prisoners from Guantanamo to face federal court trials on the US mainland if he sees fit, to rehouse prisoners in a prison on the US mainland, to close Guantanamo, to determine which countries prisoners can and can't be sent to. There was an interesting op-ed by 2 people who'd served under Republican administrations, pointing out how unconstitutional Congress's activities are. Eric Holder had made a big fuss about the prohibition on bringing men to the US mainland to face trials, because of course it's now over a year since Attorney General Holder announced that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 other men would face federal court trial for their alleged roles in the 9/11 attacks. You know, to me, I got the feeling that Eric Holder understood how absolutely crucial it was that if any attempt to draw a line to give meaning to the war on terror, it would be about this. This all started, everything that happened over the last 9 years, all the horrors of Guantanamo and the secret prisons and extraordinary rendition and torture, all started because of the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. And the men allegedly responsible should be put on trial, it seems to me. But, you know, there's been such fierce opposition to that's, you know, why this, so in such a naked political manner, was introduced to prevent that from happening. What I've been hearing about the signing statements, and we don't know yet, because, you know, we haven't actually seen what the president's going to do. One disturbing note of caution has been issued by some bloggers who noticed that the official who talked about it actually specifically mentioned pretending to be able to close Guantanamo rather than actually closing it on the part of Obama. But there has been quite a lot of mention of wanting to effectively assert his authority over Congress, but without actually doing the things that he disagrees with. You know, and it does really seem to me that there is quite a lot of truth in that. That having found Guantanamo such a political hot potato, the sad truth is that now that his eye is on the 2012 elections, the easiest thing is just to sit back, secure in the knowledge that the legislation is in place that allows him to hold the men at Guantanamo indefinitely. It's called the Authorization for Use of Military Force. It was passed by Congress the week after the 9/11 attacks, and it authorized the president to go after whoever he considered responsible for the 9/11 attacks, or people associated with them, or people who harbored them. In 2004, the Supreme Court specifically affirmed that it had a detention aspect, that going after these people, you could then hold them. My fundamental problem always with the Authorization for Use of Military Force has been that that is the founding document for the regime in which people detained by the United States are held as enemy combatants. They are not held as prisoners of war and protected by the Geneva Conventions. They are not held as criminal suspects and put forward for trials. Soldiers on the one hand, terrorists on the other. This was the point at which everything became mixed up. And it remains that. It remains that even though the word enemy combatants was carefully removed from the dictionary by President Obama just a few months after he came into office. If anybody was watching what I think in terms of national security was the most dreadful thing that has happened under Obama, which was the trial by military commission of a former child prisoner, the Canadian citizen Omar Khadr, in October, we saw in there what enemy combatants have become under Obama. And he, as part of a plea deal to secure an 8-year sentence, admitted that he was an alien, unprivileged enemy belligerent. And not only is that, you know, how ridiculous is that, but what it meant in Khadr's case was that he had to sign a plea deal which said that as an alien, unprivileged enemy belligerent, he was not allowed to be in any situation of combat with US forces. It was illegal for him to be a soldier, to fight against US forces. You know, that plus the fact that he was a child when he was captured, and that although at the time of his capture the United States had not signed it, after a few months the US, you know, under Bush, signed the UN optional protocol on the rights of the child in armed conflict, which specifically states that juveniles, defined as people under 18 when their alleged crime takes place, must be rehabilitated and not punished. And yet the Obama administration proceeded with the Bush administration's plans to prosecute a former child for invented war crimes that were invented by Congress. So, you know, I don't hold out much hope that he is going to do what he should do, which is to say, we need to have legitimate trials for these for these people that we are holding in Guantanamo that we accuse of terrorism. The task force that he convened, this very much not a liberal task force of career officials, of people from the departments and the intelligence agencies, recommended 35 of the remaining prisoners for trial. 2 of those have been sorted out through plea deals. This eternal embarrassment of the Omar Khadr case, and another case in summer of a man called Ibrahim Al-Kozi, who appears to have had the misfortune to sometimes cooked in a compound that was frequented by people who knew Osama bin Laden. Another one of those prime terrorists. 33 men, that leaves. Now, if they're serious about wanting to prosecute these people, if they have any involvement with terrorism, we really need to get on with this. It's 9 years now. Is this ever going to be resolved? The right-wing Republican position now seems to be moving from the fact that they always wanted military commissions because they regard these men as warriors, so only military trials are the way to do it. It now seems to be moving to the fact they don't actually want to try them at all. They just want to hold people indefinitely for what was such a huge crime. So what are we supposed to think? The bigger the crime, the less the chance of actual prosecution. Do we want to move to a world where the logic of this is that there are people in this country who want, when they feel like it, just to hold people indefinitely? And there are moves to enshrine all kinds of new versions of this. And the president's own, the executive order that's apparently being prepared for him to endorse the task force's recommendation that 48 men should be held indefinitely without charge or trial. But we will have periodic review. That's a whole bag of dangerous notions. You know, even overlooking the irony that indefinite detention without charge or trial was exactly what was pioneered by President Bush. Periodic review, under what circumstances are we having this review? And the whole process as well, it's a demonstration of how there are 2 processes underway with these poor guys in Guantanamo. One is the long legal struggle to get them habeas corpus rights. And the second thing is that when Obama came in, he set up his own secretive executive review body to decide what they wanted to do with the prisoners. And these 2 things are kind of running in parallel, but there's no cross-referencing them. There's no apparent indication that anybody actually cares that much. So I don't hold out much hope for the signing statement. And it's another reason that I hope, the hope that people can be clear about just these simple factors. There aren't many with the people in Guantanamo. There are, as we said before, over half the people cleared. Let's push for these people to be released. Let's push for the people who have been recommended to have trials, And let's not forget to say to President Obama that I hope that everybody in this room believes that when President Bush decided that indefinite detention without charge or trial was a good idea, we didn't agree. And it's no different when he comes forward and says, actually guys, it's quite complicated. So I think you'll have to side with me in my decision that indefinite detention without charge or trial is something that we need to do. It's not acceptable. It doesn't matter which party you belong to, which president you are. Thank you.
So I think what we saw with the resentencing of Lynn Stewart is something that's going on in many ways now under the Obama administration. And I think it's something that we need to address probably in a different panel, but that's the crackdown on dissent. That's the chill factor for people who are trying to, of course she's a lawyer, but for people who aren't even lawyers, who are now being silenced as activists because they are pushing back against some government policies. I think that's what her case kind of gave some foreshadowing of, that we're seeing now with the FBI subpoenas and with people being pulled in the wake of Humanitarian Law Project. But I think it's probably a different discussion.
She was sentenced, and Eric Holder called for her to be resentenced. She was sentenced to 28 months. It looks like there's a real serious desire on the part of the Obama administration to send this message to lawyers who might defend people like the Guantanamo prisoners. Don't do this. We need to bring Guantanamo prisoners, probably ultimately, in the worst case for them, meaning for the administration, into the United States for trials here somehow, we don't want them to be defended. We want to make sure that this is not something that good lawyers are going to seek to do. And look, if we're going to fuck with Lynn Stewart, we'll fuck with you. Don't defend these people. Just
comment on Manning's claim in the chat logs and Assange that there's a batch of Guantanamo files, which I believe are the CSRTs, about 700, 800 prisoner files. If you're prepared for the release of these, or if you know anything about them, or what the impact of the release of what I would assume would be unredacted CSRTs would be on this debate. And the other one's more of a throwaway. If Assange is prosecuted, would you CCR represent him?
So I'll take that question. I'm going to take a couple more. How about you?
Okay, just a comment. It was Obama who was trying to whitewash Bush's reputation by making him the goodwill ambassador along with Bill Clinton to Haiti. Why would you have a war criminal being a goodwill ambassador to Haiti that he helped destroy? That's it.
Congress has made groups like Wikileaks. They're trying to pass laws so that they can basically call them terrorist groups, which would make any investigative journalist a terrorist, and the people are in possession of the things that they find. I was wondering where, if you could go into where you thought this was going to play out, how it's playing out now, and in the future with elections here coming up, or even domestically, like in Europe.
Lynn Stewart is a bad example for suggesting that the administration is trying to thwart attorneys from representing individuals. I think a better example is all the difficulties that attorneys face in representing individuals, say in Guantanamo and the habeas cases, in the military commissions. And I think it's counterproductive to suggest that Lynn Stewart is an example of that. The second observation, just concerning the situation that President Obama is in right now, it has been suggested, and I think this is probably correct, that the present legislation, well, first of all, quite obviously, it only lasts until September of this year. Perhaps President Obama would privately wish that it was more permanent than that, to keep him from having to make any difficult decisions. Second of all, there are suggestions that since it only restricts the application of DOD funding to move detainees, then he could use other agencies' funds to move detainees. And so I think for those of us who would like to see him do something and want to increase the pressure on him to do so, I also think that's counterproductive to suggest that he is either prevented from doing so even under present legislation. And second of all, I think it's important to keep recognizing that even if those restrictions are what many people say they are, that they only last until September.
What they're doing is setting the legal foundation for a legal police state, which we didn't have before, even though we had unconstitutional activity like the bomb raids, for instance. And they're setting, and obviously what they're doing has nothing to do with just protecting against terrorism. The agenda is beyond that. It's to create a police state and not just suppress dissent, but actually control it and make it illegal. And any thoughts on what's behind the larger agenda, or whether or not you disagree with my take on what's happening?
The fundamental important points, right, which is that all the points that are relevant and most important about Guantanamo have everything to do with the United States, right? The Obama administration, the courts, and the Congress, and their failures to close Guantanamo with justice. And in terms of what comes out, is it worrisome, is it not? I mean, I just think that this is the fundamental story. So what to do in terms of preparation, I can't really...
These are prisoner files.
Yeah, Mike,
of course. No, I understand.
Mike was talking about one of Julian Assange's supposed secret weapons, which I had heard about months ago, actually. But I mean, it's strange, really, because I would say that that if they were to be released now, they would probably do more damage than good. They would be seized on. They would be seized on so negatively by the people who want to keep Guantanamo open forever. On the other hand, I suppose it depends how much is in there. You know, if there's a serious amount of insider internal information that explains even more about essentially about the fabrication of what purports to be evidence against the prisoners, because that's the key, really. The key really to understanding just how crazy the whole thing was is that it essentially involved rounding up a bunch of people that you have no idea who they are and then finding out. And if they don't provide that information voluntarily, or you think they don't, then you end up coercing them or torturing them, or their fellow prisoners. And, you know, and it's why, you know, one of the things that I think the mainstream media has failed at in this country over the last couple of years is in close scrutiny of what's been happening with the habeas corpus petitions, because, you know, this is in courts of law in this country, district court judges, you know, and largely, I think, have tried to approach this information in an objective manner to say, I am being asked to review this strange set of documents to ascertain whether this person in question was actually involved in Al-Qaeda and or the Taliban, or whether something has gone horribly wrong here. And some of the scrutiny that judges gave to some of those cases was a really deep insight into what was happening, was a real validation for people like me who had studied what was publicly available and had been saying, you know, this really, you really shouldn't trust when representatives of the Bush administration, or even now, the task force says, you know, oh, but this is a bad guy, this is a dangerous guy. We've got these people who we can't trust us, we can't use the evidence, but they're too dangerous to release. All these claims need testing. These 48 guys who must be held indefinitely without charge or trial. Says who? On what basis? Because the judges uncovered so much evidence of prisoners who had implicated themselves with false confessions. Other prisoners who did that. They uncovered evidence of informants within Guantanamo who were unreliable, who the authorities themselves had said were unreliable, but whose statements come up time and time again in the habeas legislation. Really very damning evidence coming out of the courts. And, you know, and apart from one or two examples, these really haven't been scrutinized properly in the mainstream media. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll probably get squeezed out of a lot of the questions. But I mean, the essence of what he's saying is that there's this widespread notion that the civilian system only can guarantee convictions, and if there's ever a finding on behalf of the detainee, that proves that it doesn't work. This was a discourse around Jelani. Like, thank God he was given the 20-year sentence for manslaughter or whatever, because otherwise, 20 to life. There would have been this sense that this doesn't work. So what's the status of a judicial process when only one verdict is acceptable? I mean, it's Kafkaesque, totalitarian, Stalinoid, whatever you want to say. That doesn't mean that this is a police state. Like their executive director, Vince Warren, likes to say, it's a national security state, not a police state. There's a difference. You can say an enormous amount in America. You can do an enormous a lot dissent-wise. You know, yes, there's massive encroachments against our rights of dissent, but there's a difference, and the dismantling the legal apparatus of the national security state is challenge enough. You know, if we're more effective, maybe it'll become a police state. But, you know, so you can take this Kafkaesque reality, and then also somewhere there is a sort of functioning legal system at the same time, and that's the paradox that, you know, we live in, and we have to retain a sense of subtlety and nuance.
I just want to say two things about the classified files that may come out. One is that, and maybe Andy said this, if they are the conclusions of military tribunals that were conducted, I think it'll be important and on us to educate the public about what those findings mean. I mean, those military tribunals had serious flaws. They allowed evidence obtained through torture. They had absolutely no independence. Detainees had no access to lawyers. So we'll have to interpret the files if they are indeed CSRT files or ARBs or whatever they are. And the second thing is I just wanted to make a point about how the government is seeking to really obstruct the ability of lawyers, for example, to use some of this information if it is valuable. And if we could talk about it publicly, the attorneys anyway who work on habeas cases or military commissions cases for Guantanamo detainees all have security clearance, or most of them have security clearance, which requires us to follow certain rules in dealing with classified information. And the government still deems all of the information that's being leaked as classified. And the fact that it's been publicly disclosed doesn't make it declassified according to the government. Declassification can only happen through a government process. So we've been getting warnings from the Department of Justice letting us know to make sure not to confirm or deny any of the information we may be reading in The Guardian or The Public or The New York Times because the government still deems it presumptively classified. So whatever may come out, if it may be useful, we would be prohibited from talking about it in a way as fact. I mean, I think we could allude to something that might have been reported in an article, but that would be the extent of it. And we certainly couldn't file it publicly in a court document. We would still have to file it under seal in court. So it's one of the ways that I think the government's trying to get in the way of our ability to actually use something that might be useful. And then just one thing on Gabor's point about the National Defense Authorization Bill that Congress passed. I just want to second that it is important to be specific about what the provisions actually mean. And I think practically speaking, there may be a broad effect, but literally speaking, it does apply only to specific Department of Defense funds. And as far as restrictions on transfers to other countries, for example, again, I think it's abhorrent what was passed, but they don't, for example, prohibit the transfers of individuals who have won their habeas cases, who have court orders for their release. So there are some limitations, and there's been commentary and even op-eds written that have characterized the bill more broadly than it's actually written, and that isn't helpful. I mean, we don't want to be talking about something that's broader than it actually is. It doesn't help us. So.
And seeking accountability for torture. I think still most of us, when we're on the streets and the subways, even with our families, right? When we say this, right, that that we're seeking accountability for torture. Torture by who? By the Iranians? By American officials. People, despite the fact that they've seen the photos from Abu Ghraib, right? They saw that, oh, maybe that was just a bad apple. I don't think a real understanding exists among the majority of people, certainly in this country, of the sort of torture that their government has been involved in. So I think just one thing I wanted to say is rather than just take it for granted that people know what this evidence consists of, right? To give it a little bit of substance for people, that when you're talking about prosecutions for torture and you're talking about Rumsfeld and this, I don't think it can be taken for granted that people really know exactly how deep the involvement of these officials were on real human beings with names and things that that you've been compiling and looking at and litigating and then advocating in non-legal settings as well. So can you actually say a little bit more, since this is such a positive way to, of course, close the night, to talk about the details of the U.S. torture program, but I thought a little bit of this and the main documents that's come, because the Obama administration, as you all know, keeps saying, well, let's look ahead, let's not look back. Or some people have been calling for truth commissions, right? But one thing that CCR has consistently said is, look, we don't need a truth commission, right? First of all, because this isn't post-apartheid South Africa, where the fabric of a society is so torn apart that there's no institutions, that the institutions aren't in place to be able to deal with the crimes that have happened, that if only the truth comes out, that'll help sort of heal the society. Here we say, look, we have the institutions, we have them, and we have the truth, right? It's not about finding out the truth, we have it, but we need our prosecutions. And this is something that we hear around CCR that I know both of you have fought a lot to make happen and are continuing to do so. So tell us a little bit about this truth of torture.
Leili, can I make a comment? There's a fabulous trilogy by Chalmers Johnson called the Blowback Trilogy. And I'm reading the final book. He just died a couple of months ago. And I'm reading his final book right now, in which he again clarifies this term blowback. And this is terribly important as it relates to 9/11. And I know, because many of the other people in 9/11 families are subject to this and don't even realize it. Blowback concerns, it's originally a CIA term, and it talks about, and what it means is foreign policy that has an effect around the world that then comes back to bite us in the ass. But
it's more specific.
More specifically, and most importantly, as Johnson makes the point in the last book, it's that people here don't realize that it was our foreign policy that caused that. And this is what exists with the causes of 9/11. We've never looked into the causes of 9/11. Most people still think, or at least half the people still think, that there were Iraqis on the plane. They don't know it was mostly Saudi Arabians. They don't know what was going on in the other countries. They don't know about our bases overseas. They don't know about all of these things. So blowback is because of what our country has been doing that then blows back at us, and we're totally innocent. We're totally unaware. The people in the street are unaware of what the causal relationship is. And that's the important point. And that's what's got to be brought out.
Right.
And that's why the 9/11 Commission was such a farce.
Yeah, and at this point I don't want to get into a whole lot of detail because it's quite late in the evening, but what I could say is look at these documents that we're putting in Spain. What we're trying to do there is break down a massive torture program for non-English speaking. You know, there are so many documents out there, there are so many memos out there. How do you even start to do this? So what a key document, I think, for anyone who's interested is the Senate Armed Services Committee report that came out publicly in April 2009. This sets out how the entire torture program was conceived of, constructed, implemented, and then spread. How what happened in Guantanamo moved to other places, to Afghanistan, to Iraq.
Can you say its name again?
The Senate Armed Services Committee report. The date is December 2008,
yeah.
but it was publicly released in April 2009, and it's a bipartisan committee thorough investigation into the detention and interrogation policies, and it looks holistically. It's one of the few government reports that actually puts a lot of the pieces together. It doesn't necessarily use the same language I would for some of the conclusions, but so much of the information is there. And in terms of what's happened to individuals, I actually would prefer not to get into certain case studies because one of the dangers I think we've done is we've reduced torture to waterboarding. Right. We've reduced torture to the very worst case scenarios. And precisely what you said when you made reference to people who are in detention in the United States, in prison in the United States, is we have torture going on in so many places that I actually don't want to reduce it to the worst case. What I would just remind people of is that torture is not only severe physical harm, but it's also severe mental harm. And when you have people who've been detained in Guantanamo without charge, without access to the outside world, often held in solitary confinement with no way out, being in this Kafkaesque world, in my mind, that constitutes torture. So I'm a little hesitant to get into, you know, the worst case scenarios of torture because it's much broader than that.
The individuals we have in front of us are people who eat, sleep, and breathe Guantanamo Bay on a non-stop basis, 24/7. I know what it's like to do that because in some sense I did that for 10 months when I was the chaplain down in Guantanamo to the Muslim prisoners, the Muslim chaplain in Guantanamo, and in my own way tried to object to the prisoner abuse inside Guantanamo when I was there. What I would like to see from all of you is to help continue to motivate these individuals to continue to do what they do. Regardless, they're going to be out there advocating for Guantanamo to be closed, to stop torture and whatnot. But I'll tell you that it does inspire people who are doing this work when they see others sacrificing as well. And that could mean sacrificing some of what we have, sharing that sacrifice. There are causes right here that we can donate to. The work of Andy Worthington, CCR, Witness Against Torture, No More Guantanamo, World can't wait. The center right here, the Brecht Forum here, to continue to do these programs. So please, let's help and share that sacrifice and do what we can also to support the organizations and the individuals who are out there doing this work on a non-stop basis.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
And I will have to acknowledge Deborah Sweet here in the room with World Can't Wait, who helped who does wonderful anti-war work, which many of you are familiar with, but also helped bring Andy here.
Thanks.
So thank you, Deborah, and I thought to give you
Well, it's all part of stopping the illegitimate war on terror, or war of terror.
So Omar the highest, who again is part of the Spain cases, is someone Andy knows very well because he's a former detainee now living in England. Is someone that from the moment, even last year when I picked up the phone and I got his number and I called him because we video conferenced him into the National Press Club last year on the same anniversary. So we saw each other, but basically through this video mechanism. Just from the moment I spoke with him, I have to say it was an extremely powerful moment for me as well. To sort of to have, both him and Dr. Abou Madian, he called in from the south of France. He was the plaintiff in the landmark Supreme Court victory establishing the right for habeas corpus. And to speak to these men who've really seen the darkest corners, really, in a sense, of the world, really, and have felt the full might of the belligerence of the U.S. states come crashing down on them and on their bodies and on their lives, and have somehow left Guantanamo and are still fighting and are still advocating for the men who remain. I mean, it really gives me courage, and I think the days when I just don't really want to get up in the morning sometimes, I mean, it actually gives me joy in a strange way through all this despair that people who've suffered so much still retain the humanity and the hope to keep on fighting. But Omar is going to give us a message. He said he's working on it actually tonight for one of us to read in DC, and he's delighted that we actually want to hear this message, and would be delighted to have as many of you as possible and your friends in DC and your networks there to hear this message delivered, because he can't come himself. So please do help us and come if you can, and send others.
Thanks, Leili.
Thank you.
Yeah.